Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 7th of October in London. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, 1 year on from the Hamas attack on Israel, the Middle East teeters on the edge of an all-out war. Goldman goes all in on the China stock surge with talk of a 20% rally, but JP Morgan and others are more sceptical. Plus, trying to change the political weather. Keir Starmer ousts his chief of staff as economic data and sentiment point to storms on the horizon. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Today marks 1 year since Hamas launched an unprecedented attack on Israel, killing 1,200 people and taking hundreds more as hostages. Israel's subsequent military offensive in the Gaza Strip has resulted in more than 41,000 deaths, according to the local health ministry. A year on, Israel is locked in a multi-front conflict that many fear could now escalate into an all-out regional war. Speaking to CBS's 60 Minutes programme, US Vice President Kamala Harris says she won't stop pressuring Israel to end its military campaign in the Middle East.
The work that we do diplomatically with the leadership of Israel is an ongoing pursuit around making clear our principles, which include the need for humanitarian aid, the need for this war to end, the need for a deal to be done, which would release the hostages and create a ceasefire.
That CBS interview with Kamala Harris comes as Israel struck more Hezbollah targets in Lebanon over the weekend. According to Lebanese officials, more than 1,500 people have now been killed in Israeli airstrikes in recent weeks, with around 1 million people forced from their homes. The region is now also waiting to see how Israel will respond to last week's Iranian missile barrage. The price of oil opened the week a fraction lower as the market waits to see how Israel will respond to Tehran for its ballistic missile attack. After last week's big jump on fears that Iran's oil supply could be targeted by Israel, Brent slipped below $78 a barrel in early trading on Monday. Speaking on Friday, President Biden said he didn't know when an Israeli response would come, but said, quote, "I'd be thinking about other alternatives than striking oil fields." The recent rally in Chinese shares is failing to convince some global investors. Fund managers at JP Morgan and HSBC are among those unconvinced by the surge in prices which followed the announcement of more stimulus by Beijing. But Jonathan Pines, portfolio manager at Federated Hermes, sees potential.
We think it's the right place to be. Now, whether or not the stimulus works in the very short term, I guess could help things along. But based on our long-term assessment, price versus value, the value is there, and that's why we're positive on Chinese equity.
Jonathan Pines from Federated Hermes there speaking to Bloomberg. Goldman Sachs has also taken a bullish stance. Their strategists see the potential for Chinese equities to rise another 15 to 20% if authorities deliver on their policy announcements. Chinese shares have skyrocketed since late September after a host of economic stimulus news reinvigorated investor confidence. The Hang Seng China Enterprises Index has jumped by more than 35% over the past month, making it the best performer among more than 90 global equity benchmarks tracked by Bloomberg. It's been just 1 month since the European policymakers last lowered borrowing costs. Now the European Central Bank could be on the cusp of another cut this month. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the story.
Quite probably is how ECB Governing Council member Francois Villeroy de Galhau described the likelihood that he and his colleagues will vote to slash interest rates this month. Speaking to an Italian newspaper, the Bank of France chief cited market inflation expectations below even the ECB's own forecast. He warned that policymakers must now be careful not to undershoot their inflation target by maintaining restrictive monetary policy too long. In recent weeks, expectations for a rate cut at the October 17th decision have gone from near zero to almost certain. Investors are now pricing an around 90% chance of a reduction this month. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
UK salaries are rising at the weakest pace in 3 years, with companies spooked by the coming Halloween budget. Data from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation shows both pay and hiring weakening. It adds to confidence surveys showing that Chancellor Rachel Reeves' repeated fiscal warnings have been so successful she's turned her budget into a make or break moment for the economy. And Keir Starmer has ousted his Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, less than 100 days into his administration. The change follows weeks of internal infighting and mounting criticism of Starmer's political operation. James Woolcock has the story.
It's a rule of politics that advisers should be managing the headlines, not in them. Weeks of stories about a power struggle at the top of government, unhappy junior aides, and a bad transition into power all pointed to the Chief of Staff, Sue Gray. So now, barely 3 months into the new government's term, Gray is gone. But the question many in Labour are asking is, why did their operation run into difficulties so quickly? And does this reset mark the end of Starmer's woes or the beginning? In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Let's go straight to the Middle East. A year on from the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, Israel is locked in a multi-front war with no clear end. This weekend saw a renewed offensive in northern Gaza and further airstrikes on Hezbollah targets in Beirut. Bloomberg's Paul Wallace, who leads our team covering economics and government in the Middle East, joins us now for more. Paul, good morning. Israel stepping up its ground and air offensive in northern Gaza over the weekend. What's the latest that we've heard from there?
A year on from the October 7th attacks by Hamas, Israel is engaged in fighting on several fronts. In southern Lebanon, its troops seem to be moving deeper into the country. There are now reports that troops are several kilometers into southern Lebanon. It's still unclear whether they're holding positions or just sort of doing short raids at the moment and then going back to the Israeli border. And it's still unclear just how many soldiers are in Lebanon. But certainly there's quite heavy fight in several villages and areas as IDF forces come up against Hezbollah's troops. And as you mentioned, there have been sort of an uptick of Israeli strikes on Gaza in the last 24 hours. The Israeli military says that Hamas has launched missile and some other attacks at Israeli positions at the Rafah border crossing and other areas. So Israel is saying it's stepping up those strikes to sort of thwart those and to thwart what it expects Hamas to do today.
We are looking at fighting on two fronts there for Israel. Of course, we're also still waiting to see how Israel will decide to respond to the ballistic missile barrage from Iran last week too. I mean, how much does all of this tell us about what's changed across the Middle East over the past year? As really it's been, an enormous amount that has happened in that time.
Exactly. And I think as horrific as October the 7th last year was, I don't think there was anybody or many people that would have predicted that, a year on Israel would be fighting in Lebanon, it would be regularly striking Syria, it would be facing attacks from militias in Iraq, from the Houthis too, very, very dangerous attacks from the Houthis. I remember when the Houthis first started saying they would attack Israel, it was seen as a bit of a joke given how far away they were in their capabilities. And then obviously the direct attacks from Iran. I mean, all of this, and none of it really seems to have an end in sight. If you look at Gaza, yes, Hamas has been so degraded as a military force, and its ability to sort of harm Israel with missile attacks has been hit, and maybe it's lost half its fighters in the war against Israel, but it's still able to act as a force of sorts, and it doesn't seem like Israel has any plan to move its troops out of Gaza anytime soon. In Lebanon, there are plenty of concerns, even among Israelis, that this just won't be a short incursion, that inevitably the IDF will get bogged down and sucked in for months and months, if not even longer. And then, we have to see how things pan out with Iran. And the most immediate thing is just what Israel does with its retaliation against the Islamic Republic for that missile attack last week. So there's so much going on here. Israel says it's not stretched by any means militarily. Israel says it's prepared and capable of taking on its enemies on multiple fronts, but certainly there are multiple crises that not just the country but the Middle East is facing right now.
And of course, at the same time, the human toll has been absolutely enormous. We're talking about the Hamas attack that happened a year ago, and then more than 40,000 people dead in Gaza, 1,500 people dead in Lebanon. That too is also very much in focus today.
Exactly. It's a horrific toll, and as grim as it is to say it, that toll is just going to keep rising over the next few weeks. There's just little to suggest that there's going to be a truce or a ceasefire in Gaza in the immediate future, or in Lebanon.
Another aspect of everything that's changed over the past year, Paul, I wonder how much of that is to do with diminished US influence as well. We heard there from Kamala Harris a moment ago talking about how she would pressure Israel to end its military campaign if she wins the election in November. Is the US playing a less important, less strategic role in the Middle East now than it was a year ago?
It's an extremely interesting question. I think it's something historians are going to pore over in the years and decades to come. On the one hand, I think this crisis, starting from October the 7th last year, shows the importance of the US. In many ways, it's been the only world power that's been important as far as Israel is concerned and as far as many other regional states are concerned. I mean, China is absolutely nowhere. Russia hasn't featured, and you could largely say the same thing about European states. But at the same time, there's been huge criticism of the Biden administration within the US and even beyond for failing to be able to sort of direct the Netanyahu government in the direction it wants. I mean, Biden wanted a ceasefire in Gaza a long time ago, and I think if he leaves office in January with the war still going on, that will be a huge personal disappointment to him and something that will taint his legacy. But he simply hasn't been able to sort of sway Netanyahu all that much. Of course, Hamas has played a big role in the failure to achieve a truce in Gaza. But certainly I think some people will look at this as a sort of watershed moment in how the US is sort of the only outside power that really matters in the Middle East. But at the same time, it's losing its influence very, very quickly.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much for joining us this morning. That's Paul Wallace there, who leads our team covering economics and government in the Middle East. Well, Friday's US jobs report stronger than expected, showing payroll growth and somewhat upending how markets are viewing the path ahead for the Federal Reserve. Our markets reporter Valerie Teitel is with me in studio for more. Valerie, this was interesting because the number sort of appeared to have caught quite a lot of people by surprise, and now the talk of no landing is back on the table.
Don't you love markets? They go one way, they swing the other way aggressively. So yes, that payroll report on Friday surprised many out there in the market. This hope for a 50 basis point cut all but erased when it comes to the market pricing. And two-year yields on the week, they jumped 36 basis points. That's one of the biggest moves in the front end since 2008. It catches some of those massive moves that we saw back in 2021 and 2022. It really paired right up with that kind of move. The other thing that really caught my eye, Stephen, is the 2s10s Treasury curve is now 3 basis points away from inverting once again. We have to take a step back and think about what this no landing risk could be. We could potentially have a Fed that goes from a 50 basis point cut to a 25, and then maybe in December they pause and they skip and they hold rates, at near 5% for maybe a few months to come, and that could have a big, ramification for the globe.
Talk to us how we should be thinking about this from a European perspective as well, because, of course, as we know, that what happens in the Fed does matter to the rest of the global economy too.
Yes, it does. So if the Fed eases less, it potentially gives other global central banks less room to ease, but it has other ramifications. We need to think about France, for example, who's got a budget that they're announcing on Thursday. There have been worries about this debt pile that the French as a nation has. If, for instance, we get the Fed on hold, there's just less room for global yields to rally, and the French yield trades at a spread to Treasuries. So if Treasuries don't go lower in yield, France could be grappling with a higher cost of debt for the next foreseeable future, and that's gonna cause a lot of people to worry. We already had our eye on this French budget, but even more so, I think there's going to be a bit more pressure. Think about the UK, who's also releasing a budget at the end of this month. There's going to be a bit more pressure on those indebted nations and corporates.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.